Hey, CNFers. Frontrunner. The Life of Steve Prefontaine is available for pre-order. Powell's, bookshop.org, harpercollins.com, Barnes & Noble. $32.99. Hey, everything helps. Every author you know under the sun begs for the pre-orders. They mean a lot. And you only have so many dollars at your disposal. So I'm just going to say, please consider pre-ordering the Frontrunner. Promotional support for this podcast is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference, now in its 26th year, final weekend of March, the 28th and 29th. Hundreds of journalists from around the world will descend on Boston, Massachusetts to hear keynote speakers like Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, Dan Zak, and Connie Chung bring the knowledge. Listeners to this podcast get 15% off your enrollment fee if you use the CNF15 code at checkout. So go to combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code. You get some nice burrito money with that.
So he hits me back and he says, the most important thing to do when we're writing is to engage with the truth. When we sit down at our writing desk and engage with the truth, we make the blank page our bitch.
Hey, CNFers, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hell yeah. This was an exciting book pitch. So I get anywhere from 20 to 30 book pitches a month. And when I saw that Randy Blythe, the lead singer of the uber heavy metal death metal band Lamb of God, had a new book out, Just Beyond the Light, I leapt at the chance to speak with him. Lamb of God makes Metallica kind of sound like Led Zeppelin, okay? And as like the big Metallica fan, that should tell you something. And I saw Lamb of God 3 times in 2009 when they opened for Metallica. It's been a while since I've seen them. They're intense, and Randy's singing voice is so different than his spoken voice. It's crazy. He was such a warm and engaging presence and a real joy to talk to, and about how he went about writing this book. He's also the author of Dark Days, which is a more traditional memoir and a more 3-act structure. Just Beyond the Light is more like linked essays and stuff with everything from death to surfing to just wild swath of stuff. It's a good hang. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can hang out and read blog posts, check out past episodes of CNF Pod, and sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. There's also patreon.com/CNF Pod if you care to window browse and perhaps share a few bucks with the podcast. Also, we haven't had any written reviews on Apple Podcasts in several months, and maybe consider taking a few minutes and leaving a kind review to help the wayward CNFer consider this little podcast that could. Well, in this episode, we talk about Randy's sobriety, surfing, songwriting versus book writing, the ugly process of writing to get to the good stuff, and what you can tell about a person by how they stack their woodpile. He's performing a spoken word tour in support of the book, which features live Q&As, and you can learn more about that at randyblythe.com. Great talk, CNFers. Here is the lead singer of Lamb of God and author of Just Beyond the Light, Randy Blythe. Riff. My barometer for it is like, is the writer like a good hang? And it was always just like a good hang to come back to your book.
Oh, awesome. That's a great way of putting it. I think when you're reading a memoir or personal essays, that's a wonderful barometer. Do I want to hang out with this person or are they highly annoying, pedantic or whatever? Lately have been, because I'm getting ready to go out on this sort of spoken word book tour where I'm going to be telling a bunch of stories that are not in the book but relate to the book's themes. I've been reading some writing by Mark Maron.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and he's a really funny guy, but also one of my all-time favorites, and I was lucky enough to meet him in Richmond a while ago at Fountain Books, was David Sedaris. And, you read his stuff and it's so funny, and you're just like, I want to hang out with this guy. He's hilarious, you know?
Yeah. Well, I love that you bring up Marin and Sedaris because that's kind of something of a jumping off point too. Is very late in the book, when you're talking about your writing and your writing process, you say that writers really stand on the shoulders of those who came before them, those people that inspired you, and it just from a writing perspective and a reader and a lover of books, who are some of those authors and books that really inspire you?
Well, I talk about this fairly often. When I was a young, angst riddled 20 something man, I read a lot of the sort of typical authors, which of course are these supremely masculine authors like Hemingway and Bukowski and Hunter S. Thompson and some Burroughs, at least for people in my sort of disgruntled age group, I suppose, young
Yeah.
dudes. And I proceeded to do a lot of the things that those authors did. I drank to excess, and I did a respectable amount of womanizing. I even got in a few fist fights. I did everything those writers did except for writing, right? I was practicing. So those writers, I think, are still important to me. They were part of my early sort of my early sort of literary awakening. But for me, and I would like to think that I would be like a manly Hemingway writer and very intense with my economy of vocabulary and short, terse masculine sentences. But I'm a bit of a blabbermouth at times. I really have to be edited. So
Mm-hmm.
I believe in the primacy of story. And one of the writers from the American South that I've loved reading since I was a young man was Pat Conroy, because my dad turned me on to him. He weaves these incredibly elaborate stories that just suck you in, and his sentences are not short and terse and Hemingway-esque. And although I wanted to be like that, I'm a lot more, I think, like a bit more elaborate in my sentences. I really have to watch myself. So I love Conroy's stuff. I also, as a young child, I really enjoyed reading things that were beyond my comprehension level. Like in the fourth grade, I read James Clavell's Shogun, right? And that's a little bit long and intense for a fourth grader, and I didn't understand a lot of it, especially a bunch of references to Japanese culture that I was unaware of. But it immediately set off this sort of lifelong love affair with Japan. And the first time I went to Japan, I've been wanting to go there since I was in fourth grade. I was just like, this is so cool. I'm here where everything happened. And the writers I like when I travel, because I'm lucky enough to travel for my band, I go to a lot of the places that I've read about. Like, for instance, the first time I went to Savannah, Georgia, of course, I'm thinking about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and going to see all these places. The first time I went to Paris, and still when I go to Paris, I'm going to all the places on the left bank where Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and all the expatriates of the so-called lost generation hung out in the 20s. That stuff still inspires me to this day. Whenever I read a book that is set in a specific place, and with Pat Conroy, it's Beaufort, South Carolina. I have friends there now. I go and visit and see all the places. Whenever I read about a certain sort of place in a book that's very place driven, I have this great urge to go and see it for myself, to see if how it compares in real life to the mental picture that I've drawn, which is one of the wonderful things about reading, as opposed to just watching, not that I don't watch movies, but as opposed to just watching a documentary about a place. When you read about a place, you construct it in your mind. And then if you go and see it, it's really cool to see how the two pictures line up. Big Tolkien fan as a young man. Read The Lord of the Rings. Big Hemingway fan, of course, and that's carried on. And as of late, just I'm reading what did I just finish reading? I just finished reading actually one of Marin's first books, but I don't have a specific favorite type of genre or anything. I just
Right.
read whatever strikes my fancy.
Yeah, and speaking of like reading above comprehension, I remember when I was in 8th grade, so I was 14, I read Catch 22 by
Oh
Joseph
boy.
Heller. Yeah. And it's like, when you read it on a superficial level, it's so wacky and funny, but when it is so subversive. And I haven't
Yeah.
read it in a long time, but it's just one of those books that it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. Him and Vonnegut, I love that kind of witty, subversive way of how they went about their novel writing.
Vonnegut, he did Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. Is that right? Is that,
Oh,
or was that?
that might be Tom Robbins. Say it with confidence, B.O. It was Tom Robbins, and he just passed away. One of those great, quirky, amazing, thoughtful writers who takes you there, man. He takes you there.
No, it's interesting reading Catch 22 at that age. I read 1984 in the year 1984 when I was 13, and I was like, "Oh my God, is this the future?"
And it is like right
And
now.
it is, and we are here. We are here.
Have you read Barbarian Days? Excuse me,
Yes.
Barbarian Days? Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I have. I read Barbarian Days, and I'm a surfer, so it's I'm internalizing that. I think in a little slightly different way than non-surfers do.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about these places, and there's a fairly good body of surf literature out there. Some kind of wacky writing. There was a guy from Montauk originally, Long Island, the end of Long Island, which is a great longboard wave, named Alan Weisbecker. And he wrote a book called In Search of Captain Zero, which is about his sort of surf adventures in Mexico and South America and all that stuff. Very interesting dude. He passed away a little while ago. But why do you ask about Barbarian Days?
Oh, just from the surfing element of your latest book, I was thinking like, all right, if you hadn't read it, I would be like, you should definitely pick that up and read it because you have such a connection to surfing now. And I figure since you did read it, it probably did really resonate with you in a way, with the way Finnegan writes about it and the globetrotting aspect of it too.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the history of surfing. He certainly writes about that. There's a lot of a darker history around surfing as well, at least in the early days. Some of the biggest surf brands that are in existence today, a couple of them were founded by these globe-trotting early sort of surf pioneers who were going to Southeast Asia and places, but they were also smuggling drugs out. Right, that's is a viable way to make a living back then as a globe-trotting surf searcher, and they would hollow out surfboards and put stuff in there. One of the guys who's in this famous documentary, The Endless Summer, did that. He wrote a book called Transcendental Memoirs of a Surf Rebel. Pretty interesting.
What I love about hearing you talk about the surfing or reading about it in the book, and also just how you immerse yourself in art, be it songwriting or writing, and how you have to just kind of muscle your way through it and sit with it. And I think surfing is a really good metaphor in a sense because you can think about catching a wave all you want, but you can only catch it if you're in the water. And sometimes it'll come and sometimes it won't. And sometimes you're going to fall and sometimes you will catch it, and you got to just surrender to that flow. And I wonder if maybe you can kind of expand on that idea because that is so integral, I think, to the way you surf, but also the way you create.
Right. Well, I think the number one thing is that I came to surfing late in life. I guess I was around, 43. I'm 53 now. And I was writing my first book, and I had rented this place down in Cape Fear, North Carolina, a place called Oak Island. And I found this killer little beach house. It was $650 a month, a block and a half off the ocean. Just wonderful. And I was writing, and I was like walking. And one day I was walking on the beach, and I saw some people surfing, and I was like, I'm going to learn how to do that. And I thought it would be relatively easy for me because I'm a lifelong skateboarder since I was a young child. And the sort of physical language of surfing is the same as skateboarding. So I thought, well, it'll be no big deal. I'll just get in the water and sort of skateboard on the water. How hard can it be? It turns out extremely hard. And it is a sort of fully immersive experience because the environment in which you're surfing is not static. It's constantly changing. There are no guarantees. Unlike if you're skateboarding, you're in a park and you see a park bench and you approach it the same way. It's a static object and you can practice again and again and again until you get it correctly. In surfing, everything is protean. It's constantly changing. So you can't plan but so far ahead. And I think you just have to do. And I think with writing, for me, it's much the same. I can have an idea of what's going to happen when I sit down to write. I can think I'm going to write this story about how I did the nonfiction podcast today. I'm going to write about how awesome it was. But oftentimes, if I'm being an honest writer, it will go a different way. I have to remain open to that. The best writing advice I ever got was from my friend Kevin Powers, and he wrote. He's a National Book Award finalist. He wrote a book called The Yellow Birds, which was made into a movie. He's an Iraq War vet. He was a machine gunner over there, had some pretty rough experiences, and he wrote this novel about it. So when I was writing my first book, I was very nervous, and I sent him, the only real writer I knew, some of the pages to see, am I on the right track? In asking for advice, validation, as it were, because the artist. So he hits me back and he says, the most important thing to do when we're writing is to engage with the truth. When we sit down at our writing desk and engage with the truth, we make the blank page our bitch. You are definitely engaging with something true. Keep at it. So how that relates to what I'm saying is that much like surfing, I can have a preconceived notion of exactly how something is going to happen when I sit down to write. But if I'm engaging with the truth, if I'm being open and really being honest, it may take a different path. And I have to accept that. I can't get upset that I did not write this wonderfully witty essay on the creative nonfiction podcast, and instead it turned out into about how I'm annoyed at the neighbors for their dog tearing up my yard or whatever. Does that make any sense?
Oh, for sure. I love the idea of, like you said, you can have this idea in your head, but ultimately you do have to just kind of surrender to the conditions of that day. And some days you just need to be comfortable with writing shit. And
Yes.
through writing shit, eventually, you do that often enough, good stuff has no choice but to surface eventually.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's sort of a misconception that people have about art in general. When they see the finished product, when they see a beautiful painting, or they read a wonderful book, or they see a band. I'm used to this. They see a band and everything is just great. The band is tight. The song is awesome. It, it doesn't just pop into existence as a fully formed product. It's a process, man. It's a process of getting rid of a lot of crap, whole lot of crap. You got to go through a whole lot of bad ideas before the one good thing comes up. I'm a photographer as well. And people I exhibit, people are like, this is beautiful. How did you do that? I'm like, I took a whole bunch of really bad pictures first. Really bad pictures. And I think that's one of the problems in modern day life, especially with social media and so forth, is people put forth this perfectly curated version of their lives or what they've made, and you don't see all the other boring crap. You don't see the process. You don't see the long fruitless hours where you're tearing your eyes out. You don't see the boredom, the
Yeah.
frustration, and the disappointment, which exists for all of us. It really does. No one sits down and is like, I'm a genius, this is going to be great, bling, out pops the Pulitzer Prize winning novel.
Yeah, exactly. And I love with let's say when like Metallica's putting out a new album, they often film themselves through the songwriting process, and they'll put those videos up, and you'll hear like the iterations of certain songs before they're final, and you're like, yeah, when they're on the final record, you're like, oh, that's great. But when you hear them workshopping it, be it how James enunciates certain words or plays with certain lyrics, you're like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, because it's not the final product, but they're workshopping it. And it's great to see even masters of their craft laboring through things. And I always use that. I lean on that as kind of a metaphor to show, like, even people who are super skilled, they're doing crappy stuff to get to the good stuff, and it's just that is part of it. You have to be patient and sit with it and think about it and iterate and just keep going in the face of that.
Absolutely. It's the same for me. Speaking of music, it's the same with me with writing lyrics.
Yeah.
So pretty much for every album my band Lamb of God puts out, all the lyrics that I write, they're generally in one notebook. I try to keep it to one notebook per album, and sometimes I go over. But when you look at the lyrics for a song that I've written and you're like, those are killer lyrics, if you could see the notebook, you would be like, oh my God, this guy's an idiot, because there is 30 pages front and back of sentence after sentence, and me writing down this idea and then changing it, crossing out, and then rewriting it below it, and then changing it and crossing out. And this just goes pages and pages. And you can see, out of 3 pages, I've gotten 2 lines. And I'm constructing the song that way. It's not like I just sit down and the muse whispers into my ear, complete song. It's just scratching, constantly scratching. Sometimes it does come very quickly. And those are those wonderful days. Those are those, television movie about the artistic process days where the person just sits down and is like, okay, blam, I'm done. That's I love those days when it just flows effortlessly, but most of the time it's a struggle.
Yeah, you're right. Those are the sitting by the fireplace, tweed sweater wearing, made for TV versions of the writing life.
Yeah, exactly. It's, you look like you're in Masterpiece Theater on PBS or whatever. And no, my new book. Look, tick, 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 tick. No. For me, it's just, oh God, when I'm deep in writing, I have to remember to take a shower. I get unshaven. My hair looks crazy. I'm just like, falling to pieces. It doesn't look pretty.
Right. I love, you're right. And kind of in that similar passage that I just cited, most days I approach writing with a sense of overwhelming dread and anxiety. And I think a lot of people, I know I can relate to that. And I know a lot of people who are listening to the show can certainly relate to that. And someone like yourself who has a book under your belt, 2 books now, and like thousands of lyrics and, dozens and dozens and dozens of songs. It's just like, it's still, every time you approach it, it's kind of like the same set of neuroses every single time.
Right. Well, I think that's important. I actually talked to a friend of mine who writes for Psychology Today. He's a psychiatrist, and we were talking about this neurosis to approaching our work, any work, and I think it's a sign of a healthy relationship with your work. I mean, you can't be paralyzed totally to the point where it's like, oh my God, I'll never be anything good. I can't do this. But you have to question yourself, I think, because once you become convinced of your own genius, I think then you've lost touch with the reality of this situation, and you're just going to churn out uninspired stuff. It's like a band that makes the same exact record again and again and again and again. Some fans will love it, but don't you want a little growth?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be willing to take chances. And so far, I've never been 100% competent in any artistic pursuit of mine. Like, I'm going to kill this. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I start off, no way. You have to go through this process. You have to just keep going through it and chiseling away and trying to find the gem.
I love the moment in the book where you're writing. Someone might have been positing to you, like, I'm thinking about starting a band. What advice can you give me that will help me be successful in the music industry? And you're like, no, stop. Wrong question. A musician needs to make music. And I kind of love that ethos that I think some people, maybe they want to be the musician spotlighted on a big stage in an arena, but they don't want to grind with the work. They want to be a writer, capital W, without doing the writing. And that passage really struck me as emblematic, I think, of a lot of what happens with aspiring artists.
Right. Well, that was me with writing back in the day, because I actually did a little bit of writing. I did some creative writing in my late teens, early 20s. I even published a few issues of a fanzine, self-published, and I wrote some. They were kind of rough-hewn, but they were fairly amusing stories about my life. Regrettably, alcohol became more important than writing, and I drank myself into a nice case of alcoholism. But I could almost justify that with looking at these sort of mythic, hard drinking literary heroes. Hemingway, of course, Hunter S. Thompson, Bukowski. Hunter S. Thompson and Hemingway destroyed their talent and wound up shooting themselves. And Bukowski just kind of drank to the bitter end. So I bought into that sort of cultural mythos of the hard drinking writer. And I talked about being a writer. I'm a writer, but I wasn't. I was a fraud because I wasn't writing. I wanted to be the writer, but I was more interested in drinking than actually doing the writing.
Yeah, there's a moment or early in the book too where you write, seems utterly ludicrous that I allowed the consumption of a cheap fermented liquid packaged in a can readily available at any corner store to define my existence, but that was indeed the case. How could I not see what I was doing to myself? My perspective was all fucked up. And how did you reorient your perspective when you made that realization?
Well, man, I tried my best to ignore the fact that I could not drink like a normal human being for 22 years. And not just drinking, I supplemented it with dry goods, a lot of those as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I did not want to accept the fact that when I drank, different things happened than happened to other people. Most people, when they go out and drink, even to excess, everybody does it from time to time. They go out, have too much, they wake up the next day with a hangover, and they're like, "Oh God, never again,"
Yeah.
until the next National Amateur Hour Day, which is New Year's Eve, Cinco de Mayo, St. Patty's Day, when everybody decides that they can drink, and then they pay the price the next day, and then they don't drink for a while. They're normal people. For me, drinking too much and winding up, getting arrested for being drunk in public, or getting in a fight, or winding up in the hospital, or winding up in the mental ward, that didn't stop me, because I proceeded to blame everybody else for my problems. So I would drink at that. And finally, what happened, I was on tour with Metallica. Speaking of them, we were in Australia. I woke up one day on a hotel balcony and I was just like, I don't want to exist anymore. Didn't feel suicidal. I just wanted to vanish from existence,
Yeah.
and I was in a good place opening up for one of the biggest bands in the world. So I was like, I really have to try something different. I have to try and put this stuff down. And I did, and that was over 14 years ago. So when that happened, there's a big fear. That's one of the questions that people ask themselves, particularly artists of any stripe, whether you be a musician or a visual artist or a writer or whatever. if you have a problem with drugs and alcohol, if you're depending on that, you tend to lie to yourself and say, my creativity is dependent on this. This
Yeah.
helps me do this, right? And I certainly bought into that great lie myself, that sort of cultural mythos of the fucked up artist. But I found when I got sober, it actually removed this sort of soggy, wet blanket that was smashed on top of my creativity, and the ideas just started flowing. It became a problem. In fact, it's still a problem to this day. I now have my main problem with creativity is not ideas. It's trying to decide which ideas to pursue because I have way too many. Way
Yeah.
too many. My brain just started firing. I want to do this. 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 I'm just one person. I can't do everything.
Yeah.
So I have to learn to focus and concentrate on the task at hand, one thing at a time. That's been the biggest difficulty as far as creativity with getting sober. If anybody out there is listening to this and you think your creativity is dependent on whatever drug or alcohol your favorite drink is, it's bullshit. It's bullshit. It's a little rough going in the beginning when you get sober, but it is in no way, shape, or form dependent upon a substance. And substances, in fact, eventually only dull your creativity.
Right. And I think a lot of people deal with, especially if they're sober, curtailing drinking significantly, is that you're viewed as kind of an unfun, stick in the mud, wet blanket. If you don't, because it's such a, this, socially acceptable social lubricant that if you're not doing it, you're some sort of a teetotaler, wet blanket. And there's like this societal pressure to kowtow to that.
Yeah, man. I think that sort of paradigm is changing.
Yeah.
Things are really different from when I grew up. I mean, I look at a lot of things through the eyes of a musician, of a music fan. And when I was young, the bands that I listened to, most of whom I'm friends with now, a lot of them were raging partiers. So it was like, of course you're going to get completely drunk and destroy things. Of course you're going to get strung out on drugs. You're a rock and roller. That's what we do. I think now it's becoming not cool to be a sloppy mess, which I think is kind of neat. I really do. I see that sort of shift in the culture in young people, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But as far as like there is societal pressure. I think it is such a socially acceptable thing, and it is a social lubricant. For me, I've just, except for at the beginning, when people, particularly fans of my band, were like, because we used to drink with our fans all the time. They'd be like, "Have a drink with me," and I'm like, "No," and they're like, "Oh, come on, dude," and I'm like, "No, no, no, no. Everything's going okay right now, right? You seem like a nice guy. I'm not being rude. No one's crying. Nothing's broken. No one's hair is on fire. All that could change if I take a drink. So let's just stay with the not drinking right now." And people eventually got it. I do not have a problem being in social situations where there's alcohol at all. It doesn't tempt me. If it just disintegrates into just sloppy, "I love you, man," I just leave, and they won't remember it anyway because they'll be drunk,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that there's a moment in the book too where you just said, I just had to keep my side of the street clean, control myself, and try not to be so goddamn judgmental. And
Yeah.
after all, hadn't I publicly made an ass of myself on many occasions? So I try to do this whenever I can. I really do. And I think that's really, I think that's a really good sort of headspace to be in, with respect to that, for sure.
Well, it's very important for me to remember where I come from and how I was when I was drinking, because as soon as I forget that stuff and I think, "Oh, I got everything under control. I'm this awesome sober dude and I never screw up." This It's only just a hop, skip, and a jump from there for me to be convinced that I am not responsible for my own actions. I don't have to, "Oh, I can cut myself some slack." And that will just grow and grow and grow until eventually I'll be like, I'm just going to have a drink. So I have to stay very cognizant of what I was. And I don't sit here and kick my own ass constantly like, you're a horrible drunk. That's pointless. And also it's just the other side of the egomaniac coin, right? I was not the Adolf Hitler of alcoholism. I was just a drunk, And if I sit there and constantly berate myself, that gets in the way of me being an effective human being. And it certainly gets in the way of me being able to accomplish anything with what meager creative gifts I do have. If I'm just sitting there berating myself, it's narcissistic behavior. So I try not to focus too much on like, or at least not just like flagellate myself over the past, but I don't forget it. I never forget it. I need to stay right sized.
Yeah, and it was talking about the mythos around thing. You were talking about the hard drinking lifestyles of various writers, be it a Hemingway, Bukowski. You could throw Fitzgerald into that too.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and then in rock and roll too, it's so baked in to that culture. So to find sobriety, I mean, you found the allies you needed, from roadies and stuff who have walked that path before. But I imagine it's difficult in the subculture under which you make a living. I imagine that was very hard to take those first steps.
It can be, In fact, like I said, I got sober when I was in Australia, and I hadn't, I was giving it a go. I hadn't drank in a couple of days, and I met this fan in the city center. I think in Adelaide. I think we were there, and he was following Metallica around or whatever. And I was sitting there having a coffee, and he walked up and he's like, "Oh, Randy, nice to meet you, mate. How you doing?" I'm like, I looked at him and I'm just like, "You want the truth?" He's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "I'm not doing so well, man. I haven't had a drink in a couple of days, and I'm trying really hard not to drink, and it's kind of rough." And he's like, "I haven't had a drink in 10 years." So I'm like, he sits down with me. And he's like, "How's it going?" And I'm like, "Man, it's pretty rough." And I'm thinking, I haven't had a drink in a couple of days, but it's tough out here because everybody's partying. So maybe I'll wait until I get home. Maybe I'll just get through this tour and drink through the end of this tour, and I'll clean up when I get home. And he looks at me, he goes, "Mate, you might not make it home." And I was like, "You're right. You're right, dude." Because I did not drink like a normal person. I was not drinking in any high class establishments out of wine glasses or whatever. I'm just throwing everything I can get down my throat and whatever else drugs came my way. And that stuff kills you. So he's like, "You might not make it home, mate." And I'm like, "You're right, dude." And I remembered that. And in retrospect, I think it was important for me to get sober out on the road because it showed me that I could do it anywhere. It wasn't easy, but I'm grateful for it. I really am, because I had these wonderful dreams of going home and going to some rehab, probably some fancy place in like Passages in Malibu or whatever the commercials are, where they have yoga and horseback riding and all that stuff, and you can ease into it in this beautiful coastal environment. That's not what was presented to me. What was presented to me is like, you have to stop and get yourself together right here, right now, or you may not make it home. And I'm just grateful for that because, my whole first month of sobriety was spent on tour. And I was able to do it. And, if I can do it out there, I figure I can do it anywhere. If I can get sober on heavy metal tours surrounded by free alcohol and drugs, I can make it through anything.
Oh, for sure. Was it one of those deals where you found when you were ready for that support that it rose to meet you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The old saying, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will appear. And if you're open to that, and we're talking about societal pressures to drink and all this other stuff, you'll find out, man, if you or have a substance abuse problem, if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, and you stop, there are a lot of us out here, and they will appear. You don't even have to look for them. It was just kind of a wonderful experience. You just have to stay open to it.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book where you talk about just a great thing that your piece of advice your father shared with you, where you can tell a lot about a man by the way he stacks his wood pile.
Yes,
And
sir.
yeah, and I really love that as an ethos because you can really apply that and overlay it over just about anything. And I imagine, like, as you turned a new leaf and 14 years sober, like that is a way of stacking your wood pile in a way of showing up in the world.
Yeah, 100%. The passage you're referring to, I wrote this chapter. I believe that's in the chapter. It's in the chapter about my grandmother, because she
Yeah.
grew up during the Depression without electricity and running water and all that stuff. And I learned a lot from her as a child. But even when I was a child, I experienced a little bit of that kind of lifestyle. Something, certainly nothing as severe as her, but like, we heated our house with a wood stove, and my dad, we used to moan and groan and about, I don't want to chop wood and stack the wood today. And he's like, do you like heat? Get busy, because that's how we heated the house. And he wouldn't let us just stack the wood in a sloppy, haphazard manner. There's a specific way to do it so it'll dry and season, and you will be prepared. You have to do it in advance too. You don't just start stacking wood in November when it's cold. You do it way in advance in the spring. You chop it, split it, stack it. That way it's going to season. And you have to lay it. You have to lay it neatly, and so that there's air space, and you don't want it out and exposed to the rain or whatever. It'll just be soggy. It's precise. And so if we were screwing up, my dad would always say, son, you can tell a lot about a man by the way he stacks his wood pile. And he was right. I didn't realize at the time he was telling me more. He was telling me something greater than just how to keep the wood stacked properly to heat the house. He was giving me life advice. And so as crazy as my life was, as haphazard as it was for a long time, with no real plan, somehow I managed to make it through and remain alive. I don't exactly know how, but now that I've taken a lot of the chaos out of my life, I'm really trying to order it in a manner that is conducive for me to do the things that I need to do and be the most effective human being that I can.
Yeah, that anecdote with your father reminded me of a bunch of years ago when I read the Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs biography, and there was a moment early in that book where Steve Jobs' father was painting like the other side of a fence that you would not normally see, and
Yeah.
And Steve was asking him why are you doing that? He's like, well, even though other people can't see it, like I know that the other side would not be painted. We want to have like basically elegant design inside and out, even if people aren't going to see it. And that goes to some sort of an internal north compass to know that you're doing a thorough job and not just doing something for appearances.
Right. Absolutely. I used to work in this restaurant in Richmond, Virginia. I was a cook and a roofer at the same time as I was in the band for the first like 8 or 9 years of our career. So I was working as a cook in this restaurant. There was a married couple who owned it, and the man, the husband, died, and we went to the funeral, and his wife said something pretty profound. He had gotten cancer, and he knew he was going to die, and she was talking to him about what's going to happen in the future once he's gone, and he's like, I want you to be happy. I want you to find someone else, to have a partner in your life, to be fulfilled, to be a complete human being, because they weren't in their 80s or anything. These were relatively young in the middle-aged couple. He goes, but I will say this: if you meet another man and you do fall in love and you want to marry him, never ever get involved with a man who, if painting a doorway, does not take it off its hinges to paint it. because otherwise he's half-assing it and sloppy. And you may not see underneath the door. You may not see right around the hinges or whatever. But a man who takes a door off to paint it completely, he's going to do a good job at most things in life. And I thought that was pretty profound advice.
Overlaying that over art or creativity is so much of the work is unseen and it's not performative. If you're doing it right, it's not performative. Like, not the final product, of course, when you're up on stage, that there's the performance element there, but so much of it is the anonymous time we spend alone at our computers or in front of a notebook. And it's the summation of all those anonymous minutes that turn into the thing that people grow to admire from us.
Oh yes, and right now I'm my book comes out February 18th, and to support it, I'm going to go out and do a spoken word tour, as I said, where I'm going to get out and tell stories on stage and that relate to the themes of the book. And right now it's a week away, and I'm practicing, and I am constantly rewriting these stories and looking for economy of vocabulary, where to cut a word here, where to cut a word there. And when I get on stage, I think it's going to look pretty cool. I think it's going to seem off the cuff. I think it's going to sound very natural. Some of it will be, but there is a lot of work going into this right now. A lot of even just tiny little things, like one word here, one word there. I am hacking away.
The book, it covers such a kind of a wonderfully wide swath of experience. Obviously it starts out with this man Wayne, who was a fan of yours, who grew to be a dear friend, who eventually dies of cancer, and then you talk about organ donors and being a match, and you talk about your grandmother and your father and writing, creativity, and sobriety. Like, there's a lot of linked things that so maybe on their surface, as I say that out loud, that don't seem very connected, but there is a through line through which you're able to braid all this stuff. And I imagine that was perhaps a challenge for you to stick them together, and you do masterfully. But I wonder, how did you string them together in a way that made sense?
When I see my first book, it was much more traditional narrative, a classic 3-act structure, which was provided by some rather unfortunate events in my life. The book is called Dark Days, if anybody wants to check it out. It was a really sort of straightforward memoir. I already knew the beginning, the ending, and it really fit the classic 3-act story structure. With this book, I had an idea that the theme of my first book was personal accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the theme of my second book, I wanted to be perspective. I wanted it to, I think a lot of my problems are a problem of perspective. So I wanted to write in an honest way how I struggle to put things in my life in a proper perspective, and what to attach importance to and what not to. So I only knew at the beginning that there were two things I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about death. Because of the first chapter, I knew I wanted to write this chapter called The Duke, about this fan who died of leukemia, Wayne Ford. And I knew I wanted to write about surfing, because this experience with this young man, it broadened my perspective. He died at a young age, but he handled his mortality just with such grace, passing away at 33 years of age. Yeah. So it was very inspiring to me to see such a young man handle this with such dignity, because I don't know what's going to happen when I die. I'm hoping that I will say something, there'll be a great last word. My inflated ego wants me to say something profound and then pass away peacefully or whatever. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I could totally panic, like, oh my God, I don't want to die. But I do know that it's possible to die with dignity, because I watched this young man go through the process and do it. So it had a very profound impact on me. So I knew I wanted to write about death through him, because that's really the ultimate fear of every single human being on earth, I think, ultimately, is our mortality. We have to come to terms with it. And I also knew I wanted to write about surfing, because that has changed my perspective for the better as well. So death and surfing, there are these two things, but that's all I knew I wanted to write about. So in keeping to the theme of perspective, I started with this fear of death and wrote about this young man, Wayne Ford. And then that made me think about fear itself. And most of my problems in perspective, I think, come from my ungrounded fears and catastrophizing of reality, in which any little minute thing I screw up, I can immediately draw an entirely logical sequence of events, from me forgetting to pick up yogurt for my girlfriend at the grocery store and ending in thermoglobal nuclear holocaust. It happens in seconds. Boom, 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 boom. This crazy catastrophizing. So that made me want to write about fear. And then I wrote about some instances of fear in the next chapter. And the idea is, once again, we were talking about staying open to the process. I did not have like I said, just death and surfing is all I knew I wanted to write about. I did not have like this perfect outline. I did not have the 3-act structure in front of me. I did not know anything other than the beginning, really. But I stayed open to the process, and the ideas came to me slowly. And I just want to make sure, though, as I'm writing, that everything I write ultimately served the main theme of the book, which I would like to think came across as the struggle for a proper perspective.
And towards the end, you write, for better or worse, this book is written by me, solely me. It's not an algorithmically assembled composite of the sum of millions of other writers' work. It's a result of my hard work, my process. And whether it's a good book or the worst one ever written, this book stands on the shoulders of giants. All those writers who came before me, who completely gave themselves to their work, and work that gave me comfort. And I love that sentiment. And I just, given that you have a huge body of work, a ton of writing, but this is a different kind of writing than you've historically done in the past. And I wonder, like, maybe what did you discover about yourself in writing your books that maybe you hadn't through songwriting, or how it's different?
Right. I think it is very different. I think certainly for me, writing a book it makes writing a song look like going to kindergarten comparatively. Like, it is a much harder slog. You have to have endurance. I think that's the main thing. You have to have endurance, because it is a sustained creative exertion that has to eventually make sense over many, many, many pages. Whereas no matter how long it takes you to write a set of lyrics for a song, the idea is expressed on a single page. If you got 15 pages of lyrics for one song, you got a problem. So it's a different approach, I think, for me. But just like with singing or any sort of artistic pursuit I'm engaged in, I'm trying to write above my talent. I'm writing to write beyond my skill level. I'm trying to write beyond my level of intelligence. I'm a man of average intelligence, but I am trying to write beyond that, write something that is useful, something enjoyable for people. And it doesn't just happen, bling, it's the process. And I think I'm trying to remember that I have to remain in the process and remain open, so that I can maybe write beyond my intelligence level and skill level. And I've heard other authors talk about this before. I've heard they say, I write beyond my own intelligence level. So it's different from writing lyrics, I suppose, in that it's much more intense. It's much more intense of trying to be smarter and better than I really am, I suppose.
Well, it's like what you were saying when you were a fourth grader and you were reading beyond your comprehension at that point. So like the seeds of stretching the frontiers of your interiority go back to when you were just a kid.
Right. I mean, I don't It's one thing that's frustrating for me when people are doing something artistically and I'm not saying that anything will ever be perfect, right? Because perfection is the death of good. Because if you're shooting for perfection constantly, you're never going to stop, right? But it does frustrate me when people make mediocre attempts and say, that's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Is it? Is it? Or can you do better? Right? Do not aspire to mediocrity. And it's not egotistical and highfalutin and self-important to want to do something great artistically. It's not. It's something that everyone should strive for who engages in the artistic process, I think. I don't want to sit down and write good enough. I want to write great. Whether or not I ever get there, that's pretty much beyond my control, but I am responsible for the effort, not the outcome.
Well, that's really well put, Randy. And I want to be mindful of your time. And as I love to bring these conversations down for a landing, I love asking the guests for a recommendation for the listeners of some kind. That can just be anything that you're excited about and bringing you joy that you just want to share with the listeners. So I'd extend that to you, Randy.
You mean as far as books, or
It could be a
any
book. It could be a brand of coffee or a brand of socks. Just anything. You're like, oh, this is kind of a cool thing I came across, and I'd like to share that.
Well, if you like coffee, which is you bring that up, I'm good. I got to give a shout out to Richmond, Virginia's very own Blanchard's Coffee Roaster, and their Midnight Oil blend is my favorite. It is how I start my day every single day with a pour over. It's wonderful. You can order it online. Look up Blanchard's Coffee from Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Randy, this was so great to get to talk to you about this wonderful book you've written and just how you go about the work. So just thank you for the time and thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, man. I hope I made some sense. I never do during these things. I never know whether what I said made any sense or not. I hope I made sense.
Yes. Awesome. Hey, thanks, CNFers. Thanks to Randy for playing ball, coming on the show, and for writing a kick-ass book. The name of the book, again, is Just Beyond the Light. You can visit randyblythe.com to see if he'll be coming to a city near you. No parting shot this week, but I'll come back strong next week. Pinky swear. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can do, interview. See ya.